Maya Chen had always been the girl who faded into the background. At 23, she worked as a junior archivist at the Metropolitan Museum, spending her days cataloging ancient artifacts in the dusty basement levels where tourists never ventured. Her colleagues barely acknowledged her presence, treating her like part of the furniture, useful but unremarkable. The prestigious research team upstairs, led by the brilliant Dr. Marcus Ashford, was a world she could only dream of joining. Every morning, Maya would arrive 30 minutes early, hoping to catch a glimpse of the real archaeologists as they discussed their exciting discoveries over coffee. She'd linger by the elevator, pretending to sort through files while listening to their animated conversations about recent expeditions to Egypt, Peru, and Cambodia. When she finally worked up the courage to approach Dr. Ashford with her own theories about certain Mesopotamian tablets, he'd barely glanced up from his newspaper. "Miss Chen, isn't it?" he'd said with a condescending smile. "I'm sure your filing system is very systematic, but perhaps you should focus on what you do best and leave the real research to those with proper qualifications." The laughter that followed from his colleagues still echoed in Maya's ears weeks later. Jennifer Morrison, the lead field archaeologist, had actually snorted. "Can you imagine? Next she'll be telling us she's discovered the lost city of Atlantis in the storage room." Maya's face had burned with humiliation as she retreated to her basement office, their laughter trailing behind her like a malicious spirit. But what they didn't know, what no one knew, was that Maya had been living with a secret that would have made their mockery die in their throats. Since childhood, Maya had carried a peculiar birthmark on her lower back, just above her left hip. It wasn't the typical brown splotch that most people associated with birthmarks. Instead, it appeared to be an intricate pattern of interconnected lines and symbols that seemed almost intentional. Her grandmother, who had raised her after her parents died in a car accident, had always been strangely protective about the mark. "Never let anyone see it, little butterfly," her grandmother would whisper during bath time, carefully positioning Maya's long black hair to cascade over the mysterious marking. "Some things are meant to be kept hidden until the right time." As Maya grew older, she began to notice that the mark seemed to change subtly over time. Not dramatically, she wasn't losing her mind, but the lines appeared to shift slightly, like a living tattoo that rearranged itself when she wasn't looking. She'd convinced herself it was just her imagination, a trick of mirrors and lighting, until she started taking digital photographs to compare. The changes were real. More disturbing still were the dreams that had plagued her since adolescence. Vivid, cinematic sequences of ancient temples, underground chambers filled with golden artifacts, and most unnervingly, people who looked exactly like her performing elaborate rituals in languages she didn't recognize but somehow understood. In these dreams, she was always wearing flowing robes, and her birthmark glowed with an ethereal blue light that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Maya had spent years researching ancient symbols and writing systems, initially hoping to understand her birthmark, but gradually developing a genuine passion for archaeology and ancient civilizations. Her undergraduate degree in ancient history and her master's in archaeological studies had been driven by this secret obsession. She'd excelled academically, graduating summa cum laude, but her shy nature and lack of family connections in the field had relegated her to this thankless position in the museum's bowels. What made her colleagues' dismissal particularly cruel was that Maya had made several significant discoveries during her time in the archives. She'd identified misattributed artifacts, corrected dating errors, and even uncovered evidence of previously unknown trade routes between ancient civilizations. But her reports were filed away, credited to her supervisors, or simply ignored. She was just the filing girl, after all. The morning that would change everything started like any other. Maya was alone in storage room C7, carefully examining a collection of tablets that had been donated by a private collector decades earlier. The tablets were supposedly from ancient Mesopotamia, but something about their composition and the style of cuneiform didn't match the documented provenance. As she photographed one particularly intriguing piece, she felt a familiar tingling sensation on her lower back. The sensation was becoming more frequent lately, usually occurring when she was handling certain types of ancient artifacts. She'd learned to ignore it, dismissing it as psychosomatic, her mind creating physical sensations to match her obsession with ancient cultures. But this time, the tingling intensified to an almost burning sensation, as if someone was pressing a heated metal brand against her skin. Maya rushed to the small bathroom adjacent to the storage room and lifted her shirt, twisting to see her reflection in the mirror. What she saw made her gasp and stumble backward, nearly falling into the sink. The birthmark was glowing. Not metaphorically, not in her imagination. It was actually emitting a soft, pulsing blue light that seemed to respond to her heartbeat. The symbols within the mark were now clearly defined, no longer the vague pattern she'd grown up with, but precise, intricate characters that looked remarkably similar to the script she'd been studying on the Mesopotamian tablets. With trembling hands, Maya took several photographs with her phone, afraid the phenomenon would disappear before she could document it. The camera captured the glow perfectly, confirming that this wasn't a hallucination brought on by too many late nights in the archives. As she stared at the images on her phone, comparing them to the tablets she'd left on the examination table, Maya realized that several of the symbols were identical. Not similar, identical. The probability of coincidence was astronomical. Her birthmark contained the same ancient writing system that she'd been studying, symbols that predated known writing by potentially thousands of years. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Either she was losing her mind, or she was connected to these artifacts in a way that defied rational explanation. The glowing intensified as she thought about the tablets, as if responding to her mental focus on the ancient objects. When she consciously tried to dim the light, it obeyed, fading until it was barely visible. Maya spent the next hour experimenting, discovering that she could control the intensity of the glow through concentration, and that certain artifacts seemed to trigger stronger responses than others. The Mesopotamian tablets caused the most dramatic reaction, but several Egyptian pieces, and even some artifacts from pre-Columbian America, produced noticeable tingling sensations. She was so absorbed in her discovery that she didn't hear the storage room door open or the footsteps approaching her examination table. It wasn't until Dr. Ashford's voice cut through her concentration that she realized she was no longer alone. "Miss Chen, what exactly are you doing with these tablets? They're supposed to be in climate-controlled storage, not spread across your workspace like... His voice trailed off as he saw the glow emanating from beneath her shirt, visible even through the fabric. Maya spun around, instinctively pulling her shirt down and trying to step away from the light, but it was too late. Dr. Ashford's expression had transformed from irritation to amazement to something that looked disturbingly like hunger. "My dear girl," he whispered, his eyes fixed on the fading glow, "I think you and I need to have a very long conversation." Dr. Ashford's office felt different now that Maya sat across from his mahogany desk as an equal rather than a supplicant. The condescending smile was gone, replaced by an intensity that made her skin crawl. He'd locked the door behind them and drawn the blinds, transforming the space into something that felt more like an interrogation room than a professor's study. "How long have you known?" he asked, his fingers steepled as he leaned forward. "Known what?" Maya's voice came out smaller than she intended. The birthmark had stopped glowing completely, but she could still feel a residual warmth spreading across her lower back. Dr. Ashford laughed, but it wasn't the cruel laughter from their previous encounter. This sound was darker, almost predatory. "Please, Miss Chen, don't insult my intelligence. You have a luminary mark, and from what I witnessed, it's one of the most powerful I've ever encountered." The term hit Maya like ice water. "A what?" "You truly don't know, do you?" His eyes gleamed with something between fascination and greed. "How deliciously ignorant. Tell me about your family, Maya, your real family." "My parents died when I was 7. My grandmother raised me." Maya's hands clenched in her lap. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Everything." Dr. Ashford stood and moved to a massive bookshelf, retrieving a leather-bound volume that looked ancient. "What did your grandmother tell you about your heritage, your ancestry?" "Nothing unusual. We're Chinese-American. My great-grandparents immigrated in the 1920s. But even as she said it, Maya remembered her grandmother's strange habits. The way she'd burn incense while speaking in a dialect that wasn't Mandarin or Cantonese, the protective talismans hidden throughout their small apartment, the nightmares her grandmother claimed to have about the ones who hunt the marked. Dr. Ashford opened the book, revealing pages covered in symbols that made Maya's birthmark tingle with recognition. "The luminary marks appeared throughout history, Miss Chen. They're not birthmarks in any conventional sense. They're genetic memories, passed down through bloodlines that trace back to the first civilization." "That's impossible. There's no evidence of..." "No evidence you've been allowed to see." His voice cut through her protest like a blade. The archaeological community has spent the better part of 2 centuries suppressing evidence of the first civilization. We couldn't risk the knowledge falling into the wrong hands. Maya felt the world tilting beneath her feet. The Order of the Sealed Archive. We've been the guardians of humanity's true history for over 300 years. Dr. Ashford turned the page, revealing an illustration that made Maya's breath catch in her throat. It showed a figure in flowing robes standing before a massive temple, arms raised toward the sky. The figure's back was exposed, revealing a glowing mark identical to her own. "This is impossible," Maya whispered, but her birthmark was warming again, responding to the image as if recognizing itself. "Is it? You felt the pull your entire life, haven't you? The dreams, the inexplicable knowledge of languages you never learned, the way certain artifacts seem to call to you." Dr. Ashford's voice took on an almost hypnotic quality. "You're not just Maya Chen, filing clerk. You're the last known descendant of the luminary bloodline, and you have the power to unlock secrets that have been hidden for millennia." The revelation should have been thrilling, but something in Dr. Ashford's tone set off every alarm bell in Maya's mind. "What do you want from me?" "Your cooperation, your gift." He moved closer, and Maya caught a glimpse of something metallic hidden beneath his jacket. "The Order has been searching for someone with your abilities for decades. We have artifacts that have remained sealed since the fall of the first civilization, waiting for someone with a luminary mark to activate them." "And if I refuse?" Dr. Ashford's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating beneath his scholarly facade. "I don't think you understand the gravity of your situation, my dear. You're not the only one who knows about your gift now. Word will spread quickly through certain circles, and not everyone who seeks you will be as civilized as the Order." As if summoned by his words, Maya heard footsteps in the corridor outside, multiple sets moving with purpose. Dr. Ashford's expression tightened. "They found us sooner than expected," he muttered, reaching for his phone. "Maya, listen to me very carefully. There are forces in this world that would use your abilities for purposes far darker than preservation of knowledge. The Crimson Covenant has been hunting luminary descendants for generations, and they've just discovered your existence." The footsteps stopped outside the office door. Maya heard whispered voices speaking in a language that sounded familiar, though she was certain she'd never heard it before. Her birthmark began to burn more intensely, the heat spreading down her legs and up her spine. "What's happening to me?" she gasped, doubling over as waves of heat coursed through her body. "Your mark is responding to the proximity of Covenant operatives. They carry artifacts that resonate with luminary energy." Dr. Ashford grabbed her arm, pulling her toward a hidden panel behind his bookshelf. "We need to leave, now." The office door exploded inward, splinters of wood flying across the room. 3 figures in dark clothing entered, their faces hidden behind masks that looked like they'd been carved from obsidian. The lead figure raised a staff topped with a crystal that pulsed with the same blue light as Maya's birthmark. "Dr. Marcus Ashford," the figure spoke in accented English, their voice artificially distorted. "By order of the Crimson Covenant, surrender the luminary or face the consequences of your interference." Dr. Ashford shoved Maya toward the hidden passage. "Run, follow the tunnel to the subway level. Find Professor Elena Vasquez at Columbia, tell her Ashford sent you and that the Crimson Sun is rising." "I don't understand any of this," Maya protested, but Dr. Ashford was already turning to face the intruders, pulling a weapon from his jacket that looked like no gun she'd ever seen. Its surface was covered in the same symbols as her birthmark. "Understanding will come with survival," he said grimly. "Go." Maya plunged into the hidden passage just as light exploded behind her. Not the warm glow of her birthmark, but something harsh and violet that made her teeth ache. She heard Dr. Ashford cry out, followed by the sound of shattering glass and splintering wood. The tunnel was narrow and dark, lit only by the increasingly intense glow emanating from her own skin. As she ran, Maya could hear pursuit echoing behind her, footsteps and voices speaking in that hauntingly familiar ancient language. Her birthmark was now burning so intensely that she could see the symbols through her shirt, casting dancing shadows on the tunnel walls. She emerged into what appeared to be an abandoned subway maintenance area, gasping and disoriented. The sounds of pursuit had faded, but Maya knew they wouldn't give up easily. As she caught her breath, fragments of her conversation with Dr. Ashford replayed in her mind. The Order of the Sealed Archive, the Crimson Covenant, the first civilization. None of it made sense, yet her birthmark continued to pulse with recognition, as if her body understood truths her mind couldn't accept. Maya pulled out her phone to call the police, then stopped. How would she explain any of this? Who would believe her? Instead, she searched for Professor Elena Vasquez at Columbia University. The first result showed a faculty page for the Department of Ancient Studies, with a photograph of a stern-looking woman in her 50s. According to her bio, Professor Vasquez specialized in pre-Columbian civilizations and anomalous archaeological findings. Maya stared at the screen, her birthmark still glowing beneath her shirt. 3 hours ago, she'd been a nobody filing clerk whose biggest concern was earning the respect of her colleagues. Now, she was apparently the last descendant of some ancient bloodline, being hunted by mysterious organizations with names that sounded like they belonged in a fantasy novel. The rational part of her mind screamed that this was all impossible, some elaborate hallucination brought on by stress, and too much time spent alone with dusty artifacts. But the heat coursing through her body and the undeniable evidence of her glowing skin made denial impossible. Maya heard sirens in the distance. Whether they were coming for her or responding to whatever had happened in Dr. Ashford's office, she couldn't be sure. She needed answers, and Professor Vasquez seemed like her only lead. As she made her way toward the subway entrance, Maya caught her reflection in a broken mirror propped against the tunnel wall. For a moment, she didn't recognize herself. Her usually neat black hair was disheveled, her eyes were wild with fear and confusion, and most unnervingly, there was something different about her face. A confidence or perhaps a wildness that hadn't been there before. But it was the symbols she glimpsed in the reflection that made her freeze. Faint, almost transparent markings were visible on her neck and arms, matching the script from her birthmark. They appeared to be spreading, as if her entire body was slowly being covered in the same ancient writing. Maya touched her neck where one of the symbols had appeared, and for an instant she understood its meaning. Awakening. Whatever was happening to her, it was just beginning. The Columbia University campus felt like stepping into another world after her harrowing escape through the subway tunnels. Students moved in casual clusters across the quad, laughing and chatting about mundane concerns like midterm exams and weekend plans. Maya envied their normalcy as she hurried toward the Ancient Studies building, constantly checking over her shoulder for signs of pursuit. Professor Elena Vasquez's office was located on the 4th floor of a Gothic revival building that reminded Maya uncomfortably of her grandmother's stories about cursed libraries. The hallway was lined with display cases containing pottery shards, carved stones, and metal artifacts that made her newly awakened birthmark tingle with recognition. Maya paused in front of a case containing what appeared to be a jade disc covered in symbols that looked disturbingly familiar. "You can see them, can't you?" Maya spun around to find a woman watching her with intense dark eyes. Professor Vasquez was shorter than her faculty photo suggested, perhaps 5 feet tall, but she radiated an authority that made the space around her feel charged with electricity. Her silver-streaked black hair was pulled into a severe bun, and she wore simple black clothing that somehow managed to look both professional and vaguely military. "Professor Vasquez, Dr. Ashford sent me. He said to tell you that the crimson sun is rising." Maya's voice cracked on the unfamiliar phrase. The professor's expression shifted from curiosity to alarm to something that looked like grief. "Marcus sent you?" She glanced up and down the hallway, then quickly unlocked her office door. "Inside, quickly." The office was larger than Dr. Ashford's, but infinitely more cluttered. Every surface was covered with books, artifacts, and photographs of archaeological sites from around the world. Maya noticed that many of the artifacts bore the same types of symbols that were now appearing on her own skin. Professor Vasquez locked the door behind them and activated what looked like a white noise machine. "Marcus is dead, isn't he?" she asked without preamble. Maya felt the words hit her like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on her own transformation and escape that she hadn't fully processed what had likely happened to the man who'd tried to help her. I don't know. There was fighting, explosions. I ran like he told me to." Professor Vasquez nodded grimly and moved to a wall safe hidden behind a reproduction of an Aztec calendar. "Marcus was my partner for 15 years, both in the Order and in other ways. If the Covenant found him, he wouldn't have surrendered quietly." "The Order? You mean you're part of it too?" Maya watched as Professor Vasquez removed several items from the safe. Ancient-looking texts, a silver pendant covered in symbols, and what appeared to be a small crystal similar to the one the masked figures had carried. Was part of it past tense? Professor Vasquez turned to face Maya, and for the first time she smiled, though it wasn't a pleasant expression. The Order of the Sealed Archive likes to think of itself as humanity's protector, keeping dangerous knowledge from falling into the wrong hands. Noble intentions, perhaps, but their methods. She shook her head. Let me see your mark. Maya hesitated. In the space of a few hours, she'd gone from hiding her birthmark to revealing it to complete strangers who claimed to know what it meant. But the symbols on her arms were becoming more visible by the minute, and she could feel new ones emerging across her shoulders and collarbone. There was no point in pretending anymore. She lifted her shirt, turning to show Professor Vasquez her lower back. The reaction was immediate and unexpected. The professor gasped and actually took a step backward. Mater de Dios, she whispered. You're not just any luminary descendant, you're carrying the Master Codex. The what? Professor Vasquez moved closer, studying the glowing symbols with the intensity of a scholar examining a priceless manuscript. The Master Codex is the complete record of the first civilization's knowledge, their history, their technology, their understanding of reality itself. We always theorized it might be encoded in genetic memory, passed down through bloodlines, but to see it actually manifesting. She looked up at Maya with something approaching awe. How much can you read? Read, Maya twisted to look at her own back in the reflection of Professor Vasquez's computer screen. The symbols were shifting again, rearranging themselves into new patterns. I don't read them exactly. Sometimes I just know what they mean. Show me. Professor Vasquez pointed to a symbol that had appeared on Maya's shoulder blade, a complex design that looked like intertwining spirals surrounding a central star. Maya focused on the symbol, and suddenly her mind flooded with images and concepts that weren't her own. She saw vast cities built from a material that looked like crystallized light, people moving through the air without any visible means of propulsion, and most startling of all, other individuals whose bodies were covered in the same glowing script that was spreading across her skin. It means the keepers of the between, she said, her voice taking on a strange, echoing quality. They were the guardians who maintained the barriers between different layers of reality. Professor Vasquez's eyes widened. The dimensional barriers, yes, that matches what we've pieced together from the fragments we've recovered over the years. She moved to her desk and pulled out a thick folder filled with photographs and documents. Maya, I need you to understand something crucial. The first civilization didn't disappear because of war or natural disaster. They were destroyed because they discovered something that should have remained hidden. She spread several photographs across her desk, images of archaeological sites from around the world that Maya recognized from her studies. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, the Nazca Lines in Peru, the underwater structures off the coast of Japan that mainstream archaeology insisted were natural formations. All of these sites are connected, Professor Vasquez continued. They're part of a global network of, let's call them reality anchors. The first civilization built them to maintain the stability of what we perceive as normal existence. But something went wrong. The barriers they were maintaining began to weaken, and things from other dimensions started bleeding through. Maya felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Other dimensions. The multiverse is far more complex than most people imagine. There are layers of reality stacked like pages in a book, and normally they don't interact. But the first civilization learned how to peek between the pages, and eventually something peeked back. Professor Vasquez pulled out a photograph that made Maya's newly awakened symbols burn with sudden intensity. It showed a cave painting that depicted humanoid figures fighting against creatures that looked like living shadows, with too many limbs and eyes in places where eyes shouldn't be. The Shadow Collective, Professor Vasquez said, nodding Maya's reaction. They exist in the spaces between realities, and they've been trying to break through into our dimension for thousands of years. The first civilization's network of anchors was the only thing holding them back, but when their civilization fell, the network began to decay. Maya stared at the cave painting, and suddenly she was experiencing another flood of inherited memories. She saw the final days of the first civilization, desperate people pouring their knowledge into willing volunteers, encoding everything they knew into the genetic structure of select bloodlines before the Shadow Collective's invasion could complete the destruction of their reality anchors. The luminary bloodlines, she whispered, we're living libraries. Exactly. And now the network is failing completely. The Order and the Covenant both know it, but they have very different ideas about what should be done. Professor Vasquez's expression darkened. The Order wants to use luminary descendants to rebuild the anchors, to restore the barriers and keep the Shadow Collective locked out of our reality. The Covenant, on the other hand. What does the Covenant want? They believe the barriers are an artificial limitation on human potential. They want to tear them down completely, to merge our reality with the others and evolve humanity into something different. Professor Vasquez shuddered. They think the Shadow Collective can be controlled, used as allies in this transformation. They're wrong, but by the time they realize their mistake, it will be too late for everyone. Maya felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was learning. But why me? Why now? Because the network is reaching critical failure, and you're carrying the complete master codex. With your knowledge, either organization could tip the balance decisively in their favor. Professor Vasquez moved to the window, peering through the blinds at the campus below. And because something has changed recently, the dimensional barriers aren't just weakening, they're being actively attacked from the other side. As if summoned by her words, the office lights flickered and Maya's symbols blazed with sudden, painful intensity. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees in an instant, and both women could see their breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. Professor Vasquez spun away from the window, her face pale. They've found us. The Covenant's tracking methods are more advanced than I thought. Maya looked toward the window and saw what had alarmed the professor. The late afternoon sky was darkening unnaturally, as if night was falling in fast forward. But it wasn't darkness in any normal sense. It was an absence, a wrongness that hurt to look at directly. The Shadow Collective, Professor Vasquez breathed. The Covenant is using shadow-touched artifacts to track you, but they're tearing holes in reality in the process. Through the growing darkness outside, Maya could see shapes moving that defied geometric logic. Things that were simultaneously too large and too small, with angles that bent in directions that shouldn't exist. Her inherited memories screamed warnings in languages older than human speech. What do we do? Maya asked, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. Professor Vasquez was already moving, gathering specific items from around her office with practiced efficiency. We run, again, but first there's something you need to know about your grandmother. Maya felt her heart stop. What about her? She wasn't just protecting you from people who might see your mark. She was a guardian, one of the few remaining members of a group that split from the Order decades ago. They believed the only way to prevent the Shadow Collective's return was to find and train new luminary descendants before either the Order or the Covenant could claim them. Professor Vasquez handed Maya a leather journal that looked ancient. This belonged to her. She left it with me before she died, with instructions to give it to you when your abilities awakened. Maya opened the journal with trembling hands. The first page was covered in her grandmother's familiar handwriting, but the words made her feel like she'd never known the woman who raised her at all. My dearest Maya, if you are reading this, then the time of hiding is over. You are not who you think you are, and neither was I. The mark you carry is both a gift and a burden that has been passed down through our family for over 3,000 years. You are the last guardian of the Eastern Gate, and the fate of two realities rests in your hands. Trust Alina, but trust no one else. The shadows are rising, and only you can decide whether humanity survives what comes next. The building shuddered around them, as if something enormous was pressing against it from outside normal space. Through the window, Maya could see students on the quad pointing at the sky in confusion and growing terror. Time's up, Professor Vasquez said grimly. Maya, I need you to make a choice right now. I can try to get you somewhere safe where you can learn to control your abilities gradually, the way your grandmother intended. Or what? Or we can go to the Eastern Gate. It's hidden beneath Manhattan, and it's the keystone of the entire dimensional barrier network. If we can reach it before either the Order or the Covenant, you might be able to restore the anchors and stop this invasion before it really begins. Maya looked at her grandmother's journal, then at the impossible darkness spreading across the sky. The symbols covering her body were now burning so brightly that she was casting her own light in the increasingly dark office. What happens if I choose wrong? Professor Vasquez met her eyes with unflinching honesty. Then reality as we know it ends, and something else takes its place. Something that makes the Shadow Collective look like a minor inconvenience. The choice that would determine the fate of two realities lay before Maya Chen. the filing clerk who had learned in a single day that she was humanity's last hope against an invasion from beyond the boundaries of existence itself. Maya looked at the spreading darkness outside, then at her grandmother's journal clutched in her trembling hands. The weight of impossible responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. 24 hours ago, her biggest concern had been earning the respect of colleagues who saw her as invisible. Now she was being asked to choose between her own safety and the survival of reality itself. "The Eastern Gate," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "We go to the Eastern Gate." Professor Vasquez nodded grimly, but Maya caught a flicker of something that might have been pride in her dark eyes. "Your grandmother would be proud and terrified." She grabbed a backpack from beneath her desk, already packed as if she'd been preparing for this moment for years. "The entrance is in the old pneumatic postal system beneath City Hall. We'll have to move fast. Both the Order and the Covenant know where it is, and they'll be converging on the location." As they prepared to leave, Maya felt the symbols on her skin shifting again, rearranging themselves into new configurations. This time, instead of individual meanings, she was receiving what felt like complete instructions. Images flooded her mind. Complex ritual movements, ancient words in languages that predated human speech, and most importantly, a warning that made her blood freeze. "Professor," she said, her voice taking on that strange, echoing quality again, "the Shadow Collective isn't just trying to invade our reality. They're trying to merge with it permanently. If they succeed, they won't just destroy our dimension, they'll use it as a bridgehead to consume all the others." Professor Vasquez paused in her packing. "All of them, the entire multiverse?" "According to this," Maya touched the symbols now covering her forearm, "they've already consumed 17 parallel Earths. We're not their first target, we're their final target. The linchpin reality that connects all the others." The building shuddered again, more violently this time. Through the window, Maya could see that the unnatural darkness was spreading beyond the campus, creeping across Manhattan like a living thing. Street lights were flickering on, but their illumination seemed dim and ineffective against the approaching shadow. "Then we're not just trying to save our world," Professor Vasquez said. "We're trying to save all possible worlds." They left the office together, moving quickly through hallways that were becoming increasingly surreal. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered between normal illumination and colors that had no names, casting shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of the objects that created them. Other faculty members and students moved through the building, but their behavior was becoming erratic. Some stood motionless, staring at nothing, while others moved with jerky, puppet-like motions that suggested they were no longer entirely in control of their own bodies. "Shadow touched," Professor Vasquez explained quietly as they passed a group of graduate students who were speaking in perfect unison, their voices creating harmonies that hurt to hear. "The barriers are weakening so quickly that people with sensitive minds are being influenced directly." Maya's birthmark was now burning with such intensity that she could feel it through multiple layers of clothing. The symbols had spread to cover her entire torso, arms, and were beginning to creep up her neck toward her face. Each new marking brought with it another fragment of the Master Codex, architectural plans for reality anchors, equations that described the mathematical structure of dimensional barriers, and increasingly urgent warnings about the true nature of the Shadow Collective. They made it to the street level, but Manhattan had transformed into something from a nightmare. The unnatural darkness hung overhead like a dome, punctured by tiers that revealed glimpses of other realities, some showing versions of Earth where different evolutionary paths had been taken, others revealing landscapes that were utterly alien. Through these dimensional wounds, things were beginning to push through. Maya saw her first Shadow Collective entity as they hurried toward the subway entrance near City Hall. It emerged from a tier in the air above a hot dog stand, unfolding itself into existence like origami made of living darkness. The creature was roughly humanoid but wrong in every possible way. Too many joints in its limbs, eyes that opened and closed randomly across its surface, and a mouth that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The hot dog vendor looked up at the creature with empty, blissful expression and began serving it mustard and relish as if it were just another customer. The creature accepted the food with appendages that shifted between tentacles, claws, and things that resembled human hands, but moved like they were controlled by someone who had only heard hands described secondhand. "Don't look directly at them," Professor Vasquez warned, pulling Maya toward the subway entrance. Direct observation creates a connection, and right now your mind is too open. You could be shadow-touched just by making eye contact. But Maya was finding it difficult to look away. The inherited memories were showing her what she was really seeing, not individual creatures, but fragments of a vast collective consciousness that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Each shadow entity was like a single neuron in an incomprehensibly large brain, and that brain was very aware that Maya Chen was carrying the knowledge needed to either stop its invasion or complete it. The subway system beneath Manhattan was in chaos. Trains had stopped running, and the tunnels were filled with people trying to escape the growing strangeness above ground. But Maya could see that there was nowhere to run. Reality was breaking down at a fundamental level, and the Shadow Collective's influence was spreading through every crack and crevice. This way, Professor Vasquez led her through a maintenance door marked, "Authorized personnel only," and down a staircase that seemed to descend much farther than the building's structure should have allowed. The walls were covered in tiles that looked normal at first glance, but revealed disturbing patterns when viewed peripherally, geometric designs that seemed to twist and writhe when not observed directly. The pneumatic postal system, Professor Vasquez explained as they reached a tunnel lined with metal pipes large enough for a person to crawl through. Built in the 1890s to transport mail rapidly around Manhattan. It was abandoned when the telephone made it obsolete, but the tunnels were never sealed. Your ancestors, the original guardians, chose this location for the Eastern Gate because the postal system created a network of pathways that mirror the dimensional anchor points. Maya nodded, though she was finding it increasingly difficult to focus on Professor Vasquez's words. The symbols covering her body were now glowing so brightly that they were providing the primary illumination for the tunnel, and each marking was transmitting information directly into her consciousness. She was learning things about the nature of reality that human minds weren't designed to comprehend, and she could feel her sanity stretching like rubber under the strain. "How much farther?" she asked, her voice now echoing with harmonic overtones that sounded like multiple people speaking in perfect synchronization. Professor Vasquez glanced at her with growing concern. "Maya, you need to fight the integration process. If you absorb too much of the codex too quickly, you'll lose yourself completely." But Maya was beginning to understand that losing herself might be exactly what was required. The Master Codex wasn't just information. It was the preserved consciousness of the first civilization's greatest guardian, someone who had faced the Shadow Collective before and knew what sacrifices were necessary to stop them. They reached a circular chamber that opened into a vast underground space that definitely had not existed when Manhattan's subway system was built. The ceiling disappeared into darkness high overhead, and the walls were covered in the same glowing symbols that now covered Maya's skin. At the center of the chamber stood a structure that defied easy description, part architecture, part sculpture, part machine. It seemed to exist in more dimensions than human perception could process. "The Eastern Gate," Professor Vasquez said unnecessarily. Maya approached the structure, and it responded to her presence like a living thing. Sections of its surface began to glow, revealing control interfaces that matched the symbols spreading across her body. As she got closer, she could feel the dimensional barriers that protected reality, and she could sense how badly damaged they were. The Shadow Collective hadn't been lying dormant for thousands of years. They had been systematically eroding the barriers from the other side, preparing for this final assault. The network of reality anchors around the world was failing not from neglect, but from deliberate sabotage. "It's a trap," Maya said, her voice now completely transformed into something that sounded like a chorus speaking in harmony. "The Shadow Collective has been manipulating both the Order and the Covenant, pushing them into conflict to prevent anyone from reaching the gates before the barriers failed completely." As if summoned by her realization, figures began emerging from the tunnel entrances around the chamber. Dr. Ashford appeared from one direction, his clothes torn and bloodied but very much alive. From another entrance came the masked figures of the Crimson Covenant. And from a third came people Maya didn't recognize, men and women wearing robes covered in the same symbols that marked her skin. "The true guardians," Professor Vasquez said. "I wasn't sure any of them were still alive." Dr. Ashford raised his weapon, the one covered in glowing symbols, and pointed it not at the Covenant operatives but at Maya herself. "Step away from the gate, Miss Chen. The Order has determined that the risk of you being shadow-touched is too great. We're going to restore the barriers using conventional methods." The lead Covenant operative laughed, the sound distorted by their obsidian mask. Conventional methods that have failed for centuries, Ashford. The girl is the key to evolution, not preservation. Through her, humanity can transcend the limitations of single-dimensional existence. The robed figures, the true guardians, said nothing, but Maya could feel their attention focused on her like a physical weight. They were waiting for her to make a choice, and she realized that they already knew what that choice would have to be. The Master Codex was now fully integrated into her consciousness, and with it came the knowledge of what had really happened to the first civilization. They hadn't been destroyed by the Shadow Collective. They had sacrificed themselves to create the barrier network, pouring their life force and consciousness into the dimensional anchors to give future generations a chance to find a better solution. But there was no better solution. The Shadow Collective existed in a state that transcended individual reality, and the only way to permanently stop them was to create an anchor that existed in the same transcendent state. Someone had to willingly merge with the dimensional barriers themselves, becoming a living seal that could adapt and respond to the collective's attempts at infiltration. "I understand now," Maya said, placing her hands on the control interfaces of the Eastern Gate. The structure responded immediately, its impossible geometries shifting into new configurations that hurt to look at directly. "Maya, don't," Professor Vasquez shouted, but it was already too late. Maya felt her consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of her individual existence. She could suddenly perceive all 17 barrier anchors around the world simultaneously, could feel the tears in reality that the Shadow Collective was using to force their way into her dimension. More than that, she could sense the presence of the collective itself, a vast, hungry intelligence that had been consuming realities for eons, growing stronger with each dimension it absorbed. The symbols on her skin were no longer glowing. They were burning away completely, the energy they contained transferring into the gate itself. Maya's physical form was beginning to dissolve, but her consciousness was becoming something larger, more complex. She felt the moment when the transformation became irreversible. Her individual identity, Maya Chen, the filing clerk who had been laughed at and dismissed, began to fade as she became something that was both more and less than human. She was becoming a living barrier between realities, a conscious guardian who could actively defend against the Shadow Collective's invasions rather than simply holding them at bay. But as her human self dissolved, Maya made one final choice that surprised everyone present, including herself. Instead of simply reinforcing the existing barriers, she began to rebuild them with a crucial difference. The original network had been designed to keep the realities separate, preventing the Shadow Collective from moving between dimensions, but also trapping them in the spaces they had already claimed. Maya's new network was designed to quarantine the Shadow Collective completely, cutting them off not just from unconsumed realities, but from each other as well. She used the collective's own interdimensional nature against them, fragmenting their unified consciousness across isolated pockets of space-time where they could never again coordinate their attacks. The process required every fragment of power stored in the Master Codex, every scrap of knowledge preserved by the first civilization, and ultimately, the willing sacrifice of Maya's individual existence. But as her consciousness merged permanently with the dimensional barriers, she felt something she had never experienced in her human life, the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The Eastern Gate pulsed once with blinding light, and when the illumination faded, the chamber was empty except for Professor Vasquez, Dr. Ashford, the Covenant operatives, and the true guardians. Maya Chen was gone, but through the restored barriers that now surrounded and protected all of reality, those who knew how to listen could sometimes hear an echo of laughter, not the cruel mockery she had endured in life, but the joyous sound of someone who had finally found their true purpose. Above ground, the unnatural darkness lifted from Manhattan as if it had never existed. The shadow entities that had been forcing their way through the dimensional tiers simply vanished, cut off from the collective intelligence that had guided them. People who had been shadow-touched recovered their individual consciousness, with no memory of the brief time when reality itself had been under siege. The world returned to normal, protected by barriers that were now stronger than they had ever been before. And in the archives of the Metropolitan Museum, Maya Chen's personnel file was updated with a single line: transferred to special collections, location, classified. But those who worked late in the museum's basement levels sometimes reported seeing a figure in the restricted archive areas. a young Asian woman who seemed to know exactly where every artifact belonged, who could read scripts in languages that had been lost for millennia, and who always disappeared when approached directly. The few who glimpsed her clearly said she seemed to be glowing faintly, as if lit by an inner light that cast no shadows. They had laughed at her once, dismissing her as just another invisible employee lost in the vastness of an institution that valued credentials over insight. None of them would ever know that Maya Chen had become something far more important than any of them could imagine. The eternal guardian who stood watch between realities, ensuring that the laughter and dreams and ordinary miracles of human existence would continue undisturbed by forces from beyond the boundaries of the possible. In the end, she had found exactly the respect she had always sought, though it came in a form she never could have anticipated. The last guardian of humanity was a filing clerk who had learned that some things are too precious to be filed away and forgotten, and too important to trust to anyone who had never been overlooked, dismissed, or told they didn't belong. Maya Chen had finally found her place in the universe, and it was everywhere at once.